Hi, I'm Alex from the Zscaler Customer Success Engineering team. In this series of short videos, we're taking a look at the baseline recommendations for configuring the Zero Trust browser function inside Zscaler Internet Access, also known as browser isolation. This is part 2 of 2, building browser isolation policies. Before we start talking about how to build policies for browser isolation and how to configure browser isolation as a feature, let's first talk about prerequisites. First, it's important to understand that in order to isolate a destination, SSL inspection must be performed on that destination, and furthermore, authentication has to be possible in order for the user to be identified and policy to be applied according to your users. Secondly, if you're already leveraging the custom root certificate feature for SSL, it must also be used within the CBI profile and deployed on the isolation browsers. With that out of the way, let's talk about the different settings that you can configure while creating an isolation policy. First, before you define a policy for isolation, you need to configure isolation itself. Isolation policies work by applying an isolation profile to specific traffic. The isolation profile defines what actions browser isolation will take on isolated traffic. The first step of configuring an isolation profile are the general features. The main things to keep in mind here are 1. If your devices support WebGL and WebGL2 hardware acceleration, you should enable turbo mode. This will significantly improve the user experience by replacing pixel streaming with rendering instructions performed locally in the browser. This is a faster and smoother experience without any security compromises. Next, select either the recommended pack file or a custom pack file URL. The recommended pack file will ensure all traffic generated by isolated browsers is sent via ZIA. Next, you'll want to enable the override pack file and return traffic to ZIA public service edge toggle. ZIA public service edges use auto geo-proximity, meaning that traffic is returned to the service edge closest to the location of the user, not the location of the isolation browser. Since the isolation browser may be hosted in a different data center from the user, overriding the pack file and returning the ZIA public service edge ensures the traffic is received by the service edge the user is connected to versus the service edge the isolated browser is connected to. This ensures a fast and consistent experience for your user. Finally, make sure to select the root certificate used by the organization, either the default one or a custom root certificate as discussed previously. Next, we come to the real meat of the isolation profile, which are the security features. Here, you'll need to make a number of decisions as to what behavior you want it to be possible within an isolated session. Do you want to allow copy and paste of files, either from the local computer to the isolation session or from the isolation session to the local computer? Do you want to allow file transfers, likewise, either from the local computer to the isolation session or vice versa? Do you want to allow printing from the isolation session? Do you want to restrict text input, making it a read-only isolation session? Do you want to render Office 365 files inside the isolation browser, thereby allowing users to view them directly inside the browser and making sure that active content can't be executed on their machine? And you want to toggle the Allow Local Browser Rendering feature, which will allow links clicked from inside the browser isolation session, which don't need to be isolated based on your URL policy, to be rendered inside the user's local browser rather than the isolation session. Obviously, the more secure you want your configuration to be, the fewer behaviors you should allow. However, it's important to keep in mind the use cases for the destinations that you're isolating to make sure that you don't overly restrict access to the isolation browser, which would prevent the user from doing their job while browsing a destination in an isolation browser. Next, you'll select regions. Here, it's generally recommended that you select all regions whenever possible to ensure that the closest browser isolation instance is used even when the user is on the road and traveling abroad. But if corporate or legal restrictions require traffic to remain in a specific country, you can select only specific browser isolation data centers. The final step in configuring an isolation profile is to configure the user experience part, that is, what the user is going to see when their session is isolated. One of the things that you can configure is the isolation banner. This is a banner that appears at the top of their browser session when it is isolated. You can customize this banner with the look and feel of your organization while creating a custom message alerting the user to isolation. If you've created a custom banner, you can then select the isolation banner you've created here, or select none for a default banner, which will show a message with the Zscaler logo, informing the user that their browsing has been redirected to browser isolation. Finally, you'll want to configure a couple of things for the isolation experience. Here you've got two options, native browser experience or browser and browser experience. Native browser experience will show the destination for the isolation session in the user's browser address bar. On the other hand, the browser and browser experience will display an address bar inside the isolation session, allowing the user to interact directly with the address bar for the isolated browser and browse to specific destinations inside the isolation session. Finally, we recommend enabling cookie persistence. This will cache any user cookies within the isolation session for 30 days. This means that any subsequent session created will leverage previously cached cookies, ensuring, for example, that the user does not have to authenticate to a SaaS application every time they open the application via isolation. Selecting cookie persistence will trigger a prompt indicating you understand that by enabling this, you are providing Zscaler and its third-party hosting services the right to store cookies. Once you've created an isolation profile, you can now leverage it within a URL filtering policy. Since isolation is triggered via URL filtering, this is configured the same way that you could configure, for example, a URL block on specific URL categories. Here you have flexibility with the criteria you can select to trigger isolation. First, you'll select URL categories. This can be a Zscaler defined category, or you might create a custom category for suspicious destinations that you want to manage. Next, you'll want to select users or groups that you want to apply the isolation policy to. Here, an additional control you can leverage is triggering isolation only for users with a high user risk profile value. This user risk score is calculated based on a user's DLP violations, risky browsing behavior, unsanctioned cloud application usage, and other suspicious factors. This means you can create an isolation policy that will only isolate traffic once the user has met a certain threshold of risky or suspicious behaviors in order to protect access to your internal applications for these users. Similarly, you can configure isolation based on device trust level, as configured inside the ZIA posture profiles. Note that to configure an isolation policy, you'll need to select at least one known user agent, for example, Chrome or Firefox. So make sure that you select the browsers you wish to isolate traffic from. If unsure what browsers your users are using to navigate the internet, you can select all of these. Finally, you'll select the action isolate rather than allow, caution, or block, and select the isolation profile that will apply the security controls you've configured to this traffic. Note that since browser isolation is a feature of URL filtering inside ZIA, this means that all isolated browser events are logged and all context is carried forward and can be tied back to the original user that generated the requests. All browser isolation traffic is scanned by the Zscaler Internet Access Security Stack, including malware prevention, antivirus, sandboxing, etc., in parallel with the data protection functions such as data loss prevention and content type policies. To get started quickly with browser isolation before you fine-tune your policy, you can leverage the Smart Browser Isolation setting. Smart Browser Isolation protects your users from suspicious domains that might host malicious content by using AI/ML models to identify such domains and automatically isolating them. Enabling this option automatically provisions an editable SSL inspection rule to inspect domains in the suspicious destinations category. The methods used to determine whether a domain is suspicious or not include but are not limited to detecting top-level domain and port anomalies, content scanning, public URL information, certificate checks, machine learning checks on the page contents, etc., etc. Finally, let's take a look at a model policy for URL filtering, which includes isolation policies. Here, the default action, if no specific matches are found, is to allow traffic. Here we have two sets of isolation-specific rules. The first set of rules is at the very top of the policy list. Since rules are executed top-down, this means that traffic will be evaluated against these rules first, and if matched, the policy will be applied. In this case, these two policies trigger an isolation for all traffic for either users who have a critical or high user risk profile, or devices that have a low device trust level. This helps to ensure that if a user's behavior is suspicious or risky, or their device trust level is low, their traffic is isolated, rendering them unable to interact with the web directly on their machines, since every page will be rendered inside an isolation session instead. Here we recommend that for this, you create an isolation profile that has strict controls in place, disallowing the user from downloading files or copying and pasting from the isolation session. The second isolation rule that we have is at the bottom of the list as the default behavior before the default allow rule. Here, this rule isolates all traffic to miscellaneous domains. This includes miscellaneous, unknown, newly registered domains, etc., and any other suspicious URL categories or destinations you wish to define. That way, traffic to these destinations is isolated, protecting your users' devices and data. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching.